General Colin Powell stood before the veterans of the 11th Airborne Division Association at their 50th reunion in 1995 and did not offer them a toast. He offered them a verdict. What they had done half a century earlier, he wrote, was the textbook airborne operation for all ages and all armies. On another occasion, he put it even more plainly. He doubted that any airborne unit in the world would ever be able to rival the Los Baños prison raid. This was not one general flattering another over dinner. Powell had commanded corps. He had studied operations that looked immaculate on a briefing chart and came apart in the field. In Panama, in Somalia, in 100 exercises built only to teach commanders what could go wrong. When he set one raid above all of those, he was not being generous. He was being exact. The raid lasted a little over 5 hours, on the morning of February 23, 1945, in a valley on the island of Luzon that most Americans, then and now, could not find on a map. 2,147 men, women and children walked free from a Japanese internment camp that day. Not one of the paratroopers who broke into that camp to get them out was killed doing it. Sit with the arithmetic for a moment. Fewer than 300 American soldiers, most of them not yet 30, dropped from 9 unarmed transport planes at dawn, 40 miles behind enemy lines, within marching distance of a Japanese division 10 times their number. They freed every prisoner. They beat a force that outnumbered them more than 20 to 1, and they did it without losing the fight to a single Japanese counterattack. Within a week, the story had already been crowded off American front pages by a photograph taken that same morning, 800 miles away, of a flag going up a different hill on a different island. Why a raid this complete is still not common knowledge is part of what this account will explain. First, the camp, and the people locked inside it. The University of the Philippines kept a college of agriculture at Los Baños, on the southern shore of a lake called Laguna de Bay, in the shadow of Mount Makiling. 60 acres of former classrooms and dormitories. In May 1943, the Japanese military administration decided the internment camp at Santo Tomas in Manila had grown too crowded and put 800 male prisoners on a train bound for that campus. Women, children, missionaries, and a dozen United States Navy nurses followed over the months after. By February 1945, the population had passed 2,000, and conditions inside had turned genuinely dangerous. Malaria moved through the barracks. So did dysentery and tuberculosis. Medicine ran short, then ran out. Survivors later described one another as walking skeletons, a phrase not meant as metaphor. Among them was Frank Buckles, 43 years old, Missouri-born, already a veteran of one World War. He had lied about his age at 15 to serve as an ambulance driver in France in 1917 and 1918. In 1942, he was working in Manila for a shipping line when the city fell. The Japanese held him first at Santo Tomas, then moved him to Los Baños. By early 1945, he had lost more than 50 pounds. He did not know, and could not have known, that he was living toward a second distinction. He would die in 2011 as the last surviving American veteran of the First World War, the war he had first run away to join. Among the internees, too, was Freddy Zervoulakis, 19 years old, the son of a Greek father and a Filipino mother, fluent enough in the local language and the terrain around the camp to move unseen where an American internee could not. On the night of February 12, 1945, he slipped through the wire and walked into the dark toward the guerrilla lines. Recapture meant a bullet or worse. He carried a message. Conditions inside were deteriorating fast, and something new was happening at the camp that frightened even the internees who had endured the longest. We will come back to what that something was. Running the camp day to day was a Japanese warrant officer named Sadaaki Konishi, 33 years old, from Fukuoka. 3 commandants passed through Los Baños in its 2 years of operation. Tanaka first, then Urabe, then, by 1945, a major named Iwanaka. But it was Konishi who controlled the food, and food was the whole of daily life inside the wire. He withheld salt rations deliberately, producing cramps he found useful for discipline. He cut the rice allowance below subsistence and let confiscated fruit rot on the pavement in 110-degree heat rather than distribute it, ordering internees to scavenge what the sun and the insects had left behind. One prisoner later testified that Konishi described himself, in so many words, as the strongest hater of the white race in the Japanese army. More than 300 prisoners under his administration would eventually die of starvation-related causes. He is not the hero of this account. He is necessary to it. 40 miles north, fighting through the ruins of Manila, was the 11th Airborne Division, under Major General Joseph Swing, and within it a young battalion commander named Henry Burgess. 26 years old, out of the Wyoming National Guard, called to active duty in February 1941. That November, he boarded a troop ship in San Francisco bound for the Philippines, 10 months before he would see the islands the hard way. Pearl Harbor was attacked while his ship was still at sea. It turned around. Burgess spent the war he had expected to fight in the Philippines fighting everywhere else instead, until December 1943, when he finally joined the 11th Airborne. Now, in February 1945, after commanding his battalion in combat for exactly 15 days, he was about to finish the journey Pearl Harbor had interrupted. One more object matters here, and it will matter again. An internee named Ben Edwards, who had escaped the camp earlier in the war, drew from memory a pencil sketch of Los Baños, the fence line, the guard towers, the barracks rows, the open ground between them. A flat, unremarkable piece of paper. It reached the intelligence officers of the 11th Airborne within days. Men would plan an assault around those penciled lines who had never once set foot inside the wire themselves. The context that made all of this urgent carried a name few Americans knew even then: Palawan. On December 14, 1944, on a separate Philippine island, Japanese guards herded roughly 150 American prisoners of war into covered trenches meant as air raid shelters, poured aviation fuel over them, and set the trenches alight. Men who broke free of the flames were shot, bayoneted, or clubbed down at the trench mouths. 11 survived, by running for the cliffs and the sea. General Douglas MacArthur received the report within weeks. He needed no second one. Every internment camp still under Japanese control on Luzon became, in his mind, a countdown with an unknown clock. The thought of their destruction with deliverance so near, he wrote afterward, was deeply repellent to me. Which is why, when Zervulikas's warning reached the 11th Airborne's intelligence section that Japanese guards at Los Baños had begun digging what looked very much like trenches near the internee barracks, no one asked him to repeat it twice. MacArthur ordered a rescue on February 12, 1945. He gave the 11th Airborne 11 days. 11 days is not much time to plan an operation of this shape. It called for 3 separate forces to reach the same fence line, from 3 separate directions, at the same minute, without radios that could be trusted to survive a lake crossing or a static choke dawn. The first wave left on the night of February 21. Lieutenant George Skau led a 31-man reconnaissance platoon across Laguna de Bay in native outrigger bancas, paddled by Filipino guerrillas, in light wind that stretched what should have been a short crossing into 8 hours of darkness. On the far shore, they moved overland on foot, linking with guerrilla units drawn from across the province, the Hunters ROTC Regiment, the President Quezon's own guerrillas, bands of Chinese resistance fighters, and communist-aligned hook fighters, old rivalries between them set aside for one morning. Their job was to find the Japanese sentry posts around the camp perimeter in the dark and remove them without a sound, before the sun and the second wave arrived together. Guerrilla scouts had given the planners one more gift, a routine. Every morning, without fail, the Japanese garrison, somewhere between 150 and 250 men, the estimates never fully agree, formed up unarmed for calisthenics at 7 o'clock, rifles stacked, guards down, a window of perhaps 2 minutes in which the men meant to defend the camp could not. 7 o'clock became the whole plan. At 4 in the morning on February 23rd, 54 tracked amphibian vehicles, LVT-4 amtracs of the 602nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Gibbs, rolled into the water at Mamonted and started across the lake, each one carrying roughly 30 soldiers from the remaining companies of Burgess's battalion. At 5:30, at Nichols Field outside Manila, the men of Company B, 11th Parachute Infantry Regiment, climbed into 9 C-47 transports under Lieutenant John Ringler. Ringler had made one adjustment to standard doctrine that would matter more than anyone expected. Instead of the usual jump altitude of 700 to 1,000 feet, he brought his planes down to 500, cutting the seconds his men would hang exposed under silk over ground that still belonged, on paper, to the enemy. At 6:58, the amtracs came ashore at a beach near San Antonio Village, on schedule to the minute. At 7 o'clock exactly, 9 C-47s crossed the drop zone and released. Parachutes opened over the fence line at the precise moment the Los Baños garrison stood in loose ranks in the compound yard, unarmed, mid-exercise, exactly as the guerrilla scouts had promised. Skau's men and the guerrillas had already gone through the perimeter posts in near silence in the minutes before. What followed the drop was not calisthenics. It was gunfire, close and immediate, before most of the Japanese garrison could reach a weapon. 15 minutes. That is how long it took ground teams to cross the compound and reach the barracks where 2,147 people had spent, some of them nearly 2 years waiting for a morning that felt less and less likely to arrive. Inside, no one had been told the exact hour. Internees heard engines, then gunfire, then parachutes overhead, and for several long minutes did not know whether to run toward the sound or away from it. Weeks and months of starvation had left many too weak to move quickly in either direction. Guards who survived the first minute fled toward the tree line rather than fight through it. Of a garrison estimated at somewhere between 150 and 250, some 70 to 80 were killed in the opening minutes and the hours that followed. Most of the men who had run the camp were now dead, wounded, or running for a jungle that offered no clear destination. The plan called for the newly freed internees to walk roughly 2 miles to the beach, board the returning amtracs, and cross back to the mainland shore, all while a Japanese formation known to intelligence as the 8th, the Tiger Division, numbering 8 to 10,000 men, sat garrisoned within a few hours' march. Every minute the operation ran long was a minute closer to that division reacting, and the internees, weak, disoriented, some unable to walk unassisted, were not moving fast. A handful of amtracs, on their return trips across the lake, came under scattered Japanese fire from the shoreline. None was lost. This is where Henry Burgess made the decision that the raid's later reputation would rest on. The written plan called for his battalion to hold the camp and wait for an overland relief column, under Colonel Robert Soul's 18th Glider Infantry, to fight its way up Highway 1 and link up before any full evacuation began. Waiting was the safe, doctrinal choice. Burgess did not wait. He judged that the column from Manila would take too long, and that every additional hour at Los Baños was an hour handed to a Japanese division that did not yet understand what had happened to its garrison. He ordered the amtracs loaded immediately, without the relief force, and to move exhausted, frightened people toward the beach faster than most of them could walk on their own. He had the camp's wooden barracks set on fire behind them, turning the one structure many had called shelter for nearly 2 years into the signal that pushed them forward. General Swing, monitoring by radio from Manila, asked Burgess to hold his position rather than commit fully to evacuation. Burgess did not hold. He kept loading amtracs. It does not read as brave on paper. It reads as a young officer, 15 days into battalion command, overriding both the written plan and his own division commander's radioed instruction, on his own judgment, with 2,147 lives balanced on the outcome. It worked because the geometry he refused to accept, waiting for a column that might arrive after the Japanese division did, was the greater risk of the two. By 9 o'clock, order of a kind had taken hold among the freed internees moving toward the beach. By 10, the head of the column reached the shoreline. The amtracs crossed Laguna de Bay twice for the internees, and a third time to lift out the last of the assault troops. The final vehicle left the beach at 3 that afternoon, roughly 8 hours after the first parachute opened. Not one paratrooper who went over that fence line died doing it. In the covering and blocking positions set along the routes a Japanese response might have used, 3 to 5 American soldiers were killed, depending on which unit's report is read. The number was never fully reconciled between accounts, and it is more honest to say so than to pretend otherwise. 2 named Filipino guerrillas, Atanasio Castillo and Anselmo Soler, died holding the perimeter, with several more wounded. Somewhere between 70 and 80 Japanese soldiers were killed. 2,147 prisoners reached the far shore of the lake alive. Among them, a 3-day-old girl carried the entire 2 miles, by hands that were not her mother's. There was no celebration on the beach. Survivors who wrote about that afternoon describe exhaustion first, then disbelief, then, for many, tears that had nothing to do with joy, and everything to do with the sudden absence of a fear they had carried so long they had stopped noticing its weight. The paratroopers, who had done the fighting, mostly sat down where they stood. They had a job. It was finished. That was the whole of it, in their own telling. No speeches, no flags planted, just men checking their weapons and counting their own. The Japanese did not let the raid go unanswered. In the days and weeks that followed, soldiers of the nearby division moved through the town of Los Baños and the surrounding barrios and killed, by post-war estimate, some 1,500 Filipino civilians, on suspicion that the local population had aided the guerrillas who had aided the raid. Konishi, captured after the war, later admitted he had helped plan that retaliation. The rescue of 2,147 foreign nationals was purchased, in part, by a massacre of Filipinos whose names appear in almost no American account of the operation's success. Both facts are true. Neither cancels the other, and any honest telling of this raid has to hold both at once. What became of the people this account has followed? Frank Buckles recovered his weight, went home, married, and spent most of the rest of his life quietly out of the public eye, saying little about Los Baños until, in his final decade, journalists came looking for the last man alive who remembered the trenches of 1918 as well as the wire of 1945. He died in 2011, at 11:10, having survived 2 world wars 60 years apart. Freddy Zervulikas walked back out of the guerrilla camp and into a history that did not record what came after. No reliable account traces where he went once the fighting moved north, which is itself a kind of quiet epilogue for a man who took the largest personal risk of the entire operation for the smallest share of its credit. Henry Burgess was promoted to colonel in the years that followed. His own written account of the raid is preserved today among the papers of the MacArthur Memorial Archive in Virginia, one battalion commander's record of a morning that historians still argue over in its details, if not in its outcome. Sadaki Konishi was tried by an American military tribunal in the Philippines, convicted of war crimes that included the starvation deaths of more than 300 prisoners and the killing of 3 American civilians, sentenced to death, transported to Japan and hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo on April 30, 1949. He was 33 years old. The question of why this raid never entered the common memory of the Second World War has an answer more mundane than any deliberate forgetting. On the same morning, American amtracs were crossing Laguna de Bay. A photographer named Joe Rosenthal, on a volcanic island called Iwo Jima 800 miles away, took a photograph of 6 men raising a flag on a hill called Suribachi. That photograph reached American newspapers within days and never really left them. Los Baños, a rescue with no summit to plant a flag on, competed for column inches against the most reproduced image of the entire war on the very day it happened, and lost that competition almost immediately. In a sense, it has been losing it ever since. What survives instead lives in narrower places, division reunions, regimental histories, the archive boxes at the MacArthur Memorial, and a scholarship foundation that Los Baños survivors and their families built decades later for students at what is now the University of the Philippines Los Baños. The same 60 acres, turned first into a prison and later back into something closer to what it had been built for. It survives, too, in the judgment of men like Colin Powell, who had no personal stake in the raid's reputation and every professional reason to judge it coldly, and who judged it, 50 years on, as close to flawless as war is capable of producing. Powell's sentence is worth returning to, now that the arithmetic behind it stands visible. 3 forces, 3 directions, 1 minute, 2,147 people who did not know the hour of their own rescue, saved by men who had given themselves 11 days to plan what should by rights have taken a month, and who did not lose the fight they came to win. The textbook airborne operation, he called it, for all ages and all armies. He was not being generous, he was reading the numbers correctly, the way the men on the ground had at 7 o'clock on a morning history mostly spent looking somewhere else.